Let's look at the possible next steps for each family in the group. There are several options open to us. Most people have tested on the 37 marker panel from family tree DNA. Some people have tested on 67, some people on 111. So one option would be to increase the number of markers we've tested on. So that would mean going from maybe 37 markers up to 67 or 111. A second option would be to test some of our more distant cousins to see if we could triangulate and identify the genetic signature of our most distant known ancestor. That'll be an option in some families, but for some families where there are no cousins to test, it will not be an option. The third option we could go for is to go for family finder testing. Now, whereas the testing we've done so far just looks at the Y chromosome, which is passed on from father to son to son to son, etc., the family finder test from family tree DNA looks at all of the other chromosomes in the person's makeup. And that is a test that actually helps to identify people who have who are closely related to us genetically within about the last 7 generations or so. Now, this might be useful for the Spear and Surname project, or it might not be. If people are closely related in the near distant past, then we may find that they match each other. If people are related in the far distant past, then it may very well be that we do not detect any signal at all. So let's go through each of the families and just see which of these options would be advisable to take up. Let's start off with Ontario 1. Now, this family has already tested one member and they have a mutation at CDYB. We're waiting for the results of a second member from this family, which will help do two things. If the second member has the same mutation as the first member, then this will imply, by a process of triangulation, that they both received this genetic signature from their most recent common ancestor, which is Tobias, born in 1812. This would be useful to define the genetic signature of this particular individual, and then testing another member of the family, a much further distant cousin, would also help to identify the genetic signature of George, born in 1775. So that is one option in Ontario Family 1, to test more cousins to see what the genetic signature of the most distant known ancestor is. However, if the sample for this subject DS, the descendant of George, turns out to be exactly the same as the modal haplotype, with no mutations whatsoever, then we can say that this genetic signature has probably passed down unchanged from the most recent common ancestor of the entire group, which we reckon to be George Spearing in 1601. And in that sort of situation, one would be able to conclude that the mutation CDYB occurred after Tobias in 1812, and it probably occurred either at one of the 3 generational levels above the current member who has tested. Would mean that Tobias either passed the mutation on to his son James, or James to Charles, or Charles to Charles Jr. So those would be the possible options for that family. There is one other possibility. If the member DS comes back with a genetic signature that shows no mutations, then it could very well be that the mutation CDYB has occurred at a much earlier point in time, and then it flipped back to the original value, so that the CDYB mutation is actually lost in this particular line, and disguised by the fact that there has been a reverse mutation. So in that situation, testing one of the other more distant cousins from one of the other lines would help just clarify if a reverse mutation had occurred. So it would be possible to test more people in this family. It would also be possible to extend the number of markers tested from 37 to either 67 or 111. That would certainly be another option. And the third option, doing a family finder test, that again would be a possibility, but I think initially we need to wait for the results of this individual here. The second family, Dublin 1, we've seen how the current person tested has an identical genetic signature to the modal haplotype, implying that that particular genetic signature has been inherited unchanged from the most recent common ancestor of us all, George Spearing in 1601. That is the most likely explanation. There might have been a reverse mutation somewhere along the path, and then that would have disguised any mutation there, but that is highly unlikely. Reverse mutations really only occur once every 500 or 1,000 years, and so it is unlikely that that would be the case. The most likely scenario is that the member tested from Dublin 1 has inherited that genetic signature unchanged from George Spearing in 1601, and it probably means that everybody else in this tree also has an unchanged haplotype which matches the modal haplotype. And any mutations that we might find in other members probably occurred after Patrick Spearin in 1802. Therefore, the value of testing other people within this family is probably of limited value, and it might be better to go for one of the other options, perhaps extending the 37 marker test out to 111 markers. Also, Family Finder has been performed by some of the non-Spearin males in this group, and it will be interesting to see if they match any of the Spearins in New South Wales, where this member here has also recently performed the Family Finder test. So let's look now at the family of New Jersey 1. This is a family that has tested their member to 111 markers, so we can't go any further on that particular option. Similarly, there aren't any cousins to test, so we cannot do triangulation, so we've lost that option as well. The last one then is the Family Finder test, and this is something that we could do, and again, this would help us identify close relatives within the previous 7 generations. So it might take us up to about this level here, but it would not be able to, well, it's highly unlikely to be able to identify any genetic cousins that are joined up by a most recent common ancestor at an earlier generational level. Turning to the family Limerick 10, this mutation at marker 446 is interesting because it's not actually in the 37 marker panel. This is a marker that was tested by the DNA Heritage Laboratory, and it may very well be that the member in New South Wales who hasn't got any mutations and the member in the Dublin group who has no mutations, they perhaps do have a mutation at marker 446, but we don't know that at this point in time because it hasn't been tested. So it might be quite interesting to test for this marker by increasing the number of markers tested up to 111 in both of these families, just to see whether we actually match the Limerick family on marker 446 and we do actually have a mutation at this marker. In terms of this particular Limerick family, Limerick 10, there are no other cousins to test, so triangulation is not a possibility. Increasing the marker to 67 or to 111 markers would be useful, and again, Family Finder could find some relatives in the previous 7 generations, but not beyond that. For the New South Wales 1 family, again, the lack of any mutation suggests that this DNA has been inherited directly from the most recent common ancestor, unchanged through the ages over the 10 generations or so between George Spearing and this person in New South Wales, and therefore testing other members of this family would probably just confirm that the genetic signature of this most distant known ancestor, James, in 1731, is exactly the same as the modal haplotype. Any mutations that are detected in this New South Wales family probably occurred after James in 1731. So testing cousins is probably of more limited value in this particular family. It would be more valuable to extend the number of markers out to 111 and also to do the Family Finder test. And that in fact is what is happening. The markers are being extended to 67, and Family Finder test is due to report in the next week or two. In terms of this family from Georgia, descendants of Nicholas from Ballingarry in 1795, there are 2 mutations in this particular family. It would be useful to test other cousins in this family to see if we could identify whether these mutations occurred after the most recent common ancestor or the most distant known ancestor, or whether they occurred at some point before the most distant known ancestor. And for the purposes of this illustration, we can see that they have occurred at a very early generational level. But doing triangulation by testing more cousins in this family would help solve this problem. Secondly, extending the number of markers tested out to 111 could provide some additional useful information, and we would be able to see whether there were any other mutations there. And of course then the Family Finder test would also be quite useful for identifying other possible cousins in the last 7 generations or so. Turning to main 1, the family of Peltiah Spearin, born in 1802. Again, I think testing further cousins in this family would also help to identify whether what we see in the member that has been tested so far, whether this is in fact a non-paternity event. Testing cousins would help us identify if there is any Y-DNA in this family that is similar to that found in genetic family 1. If we did find similar or a match to people in genetic family 1 from one of the cousins of this person, then that would imply that there's been a non-paternity event in this person's recent past, but that Peltiah Spearin in 1802 is in fact genetically related to genetic family 1. So the same could apply to the second main family, and again testing more cousins in this particular family would help answer the question, is this an entirely distinct family, or can we find distant cousins that do share Y-DNA that is similar to that found in genetic family 1, indicating that their common ancestor is also George Spearing from London in 1601. So testing further cousins would certainly be useful in this family. Also, increasing the number of markers out to 111 would not be of particular relevance, and would be of no value really to the project at this point in time for this member, because they do not match the members in genetic family 1. So at this point in time, extending the number of markers tested would not be of any particular value. Nor would the Family Finder test, because this would not hook up with Spearin relatives. It would hook up with the relatives of the non-Spearin Y-DNA that has been introduced in the recent past, if this is a non-paternity event. Lastly, looking at the family Ontario 2, this has 3 mutations. It would be useful to extend the number of markers out to 111. It would also be useful to test cousins to try to triangulate the genetic signature of the most distant known ancestor, John, in 1802. And also it would be helpful to do this to see whether the mutations that we've identified so far occurred after the most distant known ancestor or sometime before the most distant known ancestor. So there you go. Those are the type of tests that we could do to try to further elucidate the mystery that is the Spearin surname project.